Well, noisy data has, sort of high degree of variability, and also a greater range of scores or reaction times, whatever it is you're measuring. In a lot of the cochlear implant studies that we're doing now, we're using eye tracking. And so it would be more variability in how they look at the pictures that they're shown as they hear words. And really just variability in success or in performance ranging from what might be considered on a given trial to be a failure versus a success. And the other part of the variability actually comes in terms of the individual items. So it may be that for these children who are outliers, they have particular problems with particular items on the experimental task that we don't anticipate. I mean, we control certain variables, but there's always the possibility with the kind of statistical analysis I described to also go back and do item analyses and find out if this child who's performing over here versus the child who's performing sort of more at the mean or median, if this child is having particular problems with specific kinds of items. And you can go back post hoc and really look at what are the characteristics that you didn't control that might be affecting the performance for this child. What we do in research with clinical populations is very often create these groups, and we do these group comparisons, and which actually masks individual differences. And very often when you do these group comparisons, your data are fairly noisy, and often noisier for the clinical group than the typical control group. And so in those cases, I think it's particularly interesting to think about the noise and to think about ways to do the group comparisons, which I still believe are important, but also to look at the individual differences among the children, in my case, because I do research with children, in the clinical group. We've begun this move away from analysis of variance, which has been the sort of typical statistical approach to these data. An analysis of variance requires that you have these two distinct groups. And sometimes what happens in that case is that your group definitions, either for the typically developing children or for the clinical group, are such that you have to exclude children who are in the middle, who are not quite within normal limits, but they're not impaired enough to be within the language disorders group, whatever group that is. And what we've been trying to do, like some other fields in behavioral sciences, is move towards a different kind of statistical model, which is called varyingly mixed model analyses or hierarchical logistic regression or hierarchical linear models. But they're all sort of the same thing. It's a statistical analysis rather than groups that is derived from regression analyses. And then what you can do is throw all your children in, typically developing and not, and then take certain scores, whether it's their performance on the experimental task or their performance on the test battery that you give them, and look at how it predicts their actual performance on the tasks. And this yields, first of all, an inclusion of more subjects. And it allows you to look at these individual differences. So you begin to see who the outliers are. And you can begin to understand what demographic variables condition their outlying performance on the experimental tasks. And I really think that that's a very important move forward for our field, as opposed to these sort of forced groups which then exclude children who are sort of in the middle. Well, I think about this a lot with this current grant that I have that's looking at lexical access and language processing more generally in children with cochlear implants. Because the whole story of cochlear implantation, in terms of its main goal, which is to give children the opportunity to acquire oral language, yields a wide range of outcomes. So some children are absolute stars, and you, at least on the surface, although they may still have some underlying deficits, but on the surface, their language is as good as any peer they're compared to. Whereas there are other children who really don't do as well with the same opportunities, the same device, the same intervention. And we really don't know still what causes that range of outcomes in children with cochlear implants. And we know some obvious things like, earlier implantations better, good intervention, good habilitation is better. But there are many, we're sure, unknown factors in this. And I think it's important for us not only to do the comparisons that we're obligated to do on the grant, which is to compare the children with CIs to their typically developing peers or typically hearing peers, but also to really understand if there are subgroups among the children and if some of the demographic data that we collect might predict what the outcomes are. Well, for me, it's a new thing, and I'm at a point in my career where I was hoping to just keep doing analyses of variance until retirement. But what happened is that I had a doctoral student whose data were particularly well suited to this newer kind of analysis. And we had a lot of help from a faculty member and a doctoral student in our EdPsych program who are statisticians. And so that exposure made me start reading, and then I went to a couple of workshops, and I sort of pushed myself, despite my reluctance, to add this new tool to my research repertoire to learn this because I saw the value in it. And I think that's so my students up until the last couple of years have been trained by me to think in terms of analysis of variance designs. And the newer students are hearing this kind of approach. So the older students are going to have to sort of do what I do, which is to retool. There are lots of places where you can go for workshops. Lots of universities have people in the stat department or EdPsych or in psychology who do these analyses, and I would suggest they contact them.